Hi guys, and welcome to this video which is for Year 12 Business Management, Unit 3 Outcome 2, which is all about human resource management. We're up to our second last key knowledge point, 2.9, and in this video we're going to look at agreements. Specifically, how do businesses and the employees determine the wages and conditions for work? How do they come up with the agreements? Specifically, we are going to look at what we mean by an award, or an agreement, in particular a collective agreement or enterprise agreement, as two common methods for determining these wages and conditions of work. We will need to know what we mean by awards and agreements, so we're going to need to know the characteristics. And we're also going to need to know the advantages and disadvantages of each. And given we have just done key knowledge point 2.8, the roles of different participants in the workplace relationship biosphere, what are their roles for each of those? So when we think about workplace relations, this is a key aspect of it. Remembering workplace relationship is this total relationship that exists between the employer and the employee, and thinking about how they interact. How they interact to determine an acceptable level of pay and working conditions. How they interact is ultimately going to need to result in an agreement. Now, the methods for determining this agreement or determining the wages and conditions for work can be split up into what we call centralized or decentralized methods. When we're talking about centralized, we are going to talk about an entire industry-wide agreement. So it is coming from the center. And in this case, we're talking about industry-wide or modern awards. When we talk about decentralized, we're going to talk about business-specific within an industry. So it's decentralized because while this might be the industry, there might be lots and lots of different businesses within it, and they are all going to come up with their own agreement, as opposed to it coming from the center and it's spreading out to all of the businesses. When we're talking about decentralized, we're going to talk about collective bargaining or collective agreements. We also might call it an enterprise agreement or individual specific contracts. So we're going to look at these graphs or charts in more detail when we talk about them. But just so we are clear, when we talk about a centralized workplace relations agreement, we are talking about an agreement that determines the wages and conditions for an entire industry. Now, a decentralized workplace relations is going to work out who is going to be the conditions and wages for an individual business. And it's going to involve some minimum standards, but that is what we're talking about. And the first one of these that we're going to look at is industry-wide awards. And this is what we are talking about when we consider centralized agreements. Now, historically, up until the early 90s, employees and the businesses conducted centralized agreements. This is where the employees had their wages and working conditions set by something called an award, which applied, and this is the key bit, to an entire industry or occupation, i.e. the manufacturing or hospitality industry. Now, the awards were legally set out, or the legally binding wages and conditions for a specific industry. It was set up by industrial tribunals, i.e. the Fair Work Commission, following significant union and employer submissions. So an award created for the entire industry after the businesses and employees or their representatives, unions and employer associations, negotiated and put submissions in. Now, in this case, or as we have become more developed or modernized, our awards have also modernized. There used to be over 1,500 of these. And in 2009, this was significantly reduced and consolidated into 122. This is because under the Workplace Relations Amendment Act in 2008, a process was established to modernize and simplify them. because there was lots of inconsistencies, overlap. 1,500 awards recommends that there is 1,500 industries or occupations. That is significantly too complex. So this was modernized to create 122, and combined with that, the Fair Work Commission set out the 10 National Employment Standards, or NES. This, for all of these awards, set out a safety net of basic minimum conditions. Now, the awards and enterprise agreements that we're going to talk about can never do a conditional wage that is less than what is in this National Employment Standards. These National Employment Standards, as you can see, talk about 10 standards, i.e. the minimum weekly hours you can work, the maximum weekly hours you can work, the pay, the amount of annual leave you get, long service leave. You're welcome to have a read of this. The important bit is these are the standards that can never be a go below. So for example, you can never pay someone below the minimum wage. So what is included in these modern awards that cover an entire industry? Often they outline the minimum wages for a particular occupation, the working conditions, how long they can work, how does overtime work, do they get a meal break, holiday and leave, do they get penalty rates if they work on the weekends or at different hours, and the procedures for how they will resolve problems and even terminate someone. And you can see here, this is a little bit older, you can see they outline, even if when the minimum wage, which I think is $21.38 at the moment, that even outlines people younger than that, like many of the people watching this, how much you get paid. So to just recap before we look at the advantages and disadvantages, when we are looking at a centralized system, we are thinking about awards. It is the award that works out the wages and conditions for the entire industry. In this case, employees and employers will negotiate and put their submissions to some independent government tribunal, generally the Fair Work Commission. When it is all approved, these are the awards and conditions for the entire industry. Now, in terms of advantages, there are a number of advantages for having an award for an entire industry. I'm going to just skim over this. I'm going to encourage you to pause this and think about these. Some of the advantages include wage equality. All the workers have the same entitlements in that industry. This creates transparency. It means that it is a stable and predictable set of rules. And it means that the employees throughout this have been represented by people that are skilled in negotiating, the unions, because it is not meaning that smaller businesses with not many employees are don't have much power. This means if there is a dispute, these can often be reduced as it covers an entire industry, so it's not going to be necessarily one specific business that is going to dispute it. And it does establish these legal minimum requirements. Now, what are their disadvantages? While it creates equality, it also creates a highly inflexible system. And agreements, for example, agreements apply to large businesses in capital cities and small businesses in country towns, and they're going to be very different. It's going to be difficult to establish incentives for individuals to be more productive. You're going to be paid the same in that entire industry, regardless of your productivity. And if there is disputes, because it's for an entire industry, sometimes the unions realized they had a lot of power and they were able to create highly disruptive, large-scale industrial action. And because there is an entire industry-wide, it sometimes meant that specific businesses had less power and there was less incentive for participative approach to workplace relations where employees and employees of a particular business, so the employees of a business, would meet with their managers to discuss their wants, needs, and the conflict, because they didn't really have much of a power to change it. So I want you to think now and pause. Do you think that this was a good or is a good way to determine agreements? Because some people didn't think this was, and this is where we come to a collective enterprise agreement. This is where we are talking about decentralized agreements. In the early 1990s, this particularly happened quite a lot. The Australian workplace relations systems was heavily deregulated. Regulations, restrictions removed, and this created a more decentralized approach for determining wages and conditions. This is where individual employers or businesses and their employees were able to freely negotiate what they thought was the best wages and conditions for that business, the most appropriate. When an agreement is made between a business and their employees, and we are talking about an individual in business and employees, we would say that we have created a collective agreement, also known as an enterprise agreement, but we will call it a collective agreement now. And this has now become more and more the norm for determining wages and conditions. So what is a collective or enterprise agreement? It refers to the written agreement, it must be written, negotiated directly by the employment and the employer and the employees for the wages and conditions. It's often, this agreement is reached through a process called enterprise bargaining, and that's why it's sometimes called an enterprise agreement. An enterprise is another name for a business, so it is just bargaining within the business. Now, these collective agreements cannot provide conditions that are less than the National Employment Standard, so that does not change. But unlike awards, these can be tailored to meet the needs of the employer and the employees. They might feel like they have something specific that is different. They might want to pay more or maybe even less than the agreement, although that's quite uncommon. They might feel like their leave is different. And these are the uniqueness of each business is able to be taken into account when doing collective agreements. What must all collective agreements include? They must have an expiry date. They must have a procedure for settling disputes. They must provide for some individual flexibility. And they should always recognize that if there are changes, employees should be consulted. This good faith bargaining requirement is an expectation and a recognition if employers and employees are going to be negotiating individually, so one business and its group of employees, this negotiation should come with good faith. Both parties should come together with good intentions. And you can read here some of the reasons, some of the ways that they can do this. And I encourage you to pause this slide. Now, what is the role of the Fair Work Commission in these agreements? It's important to recognize for enterprise agreements as well, that even if both parties agree, they still must be submitted to the Fair Work Commission for approval. The umpire gets to determine that it is an appropriate enterprise agreement. They want to be checking that there has been good faith bargaining. What are they going to look for? They need to find evidence that both the employer and the employee agree to the majority of this agreement, that the majority of employees have been consulted. This might mean the unions have been consulted. They must be checked, and this is why maybe I talked falsely before. A collective agreement must mean that the employee will be better off than the award. So the potential award that covers that industry. You should not be worse off because the business has forced you to negotiate. And it must abide with the national employment standards. Now, finally, we're not going to talk about this for long. If you are a particular senior person or maybe in a unique contract circumstance, maybe you might negotiate individually with your business to come up with a legally binding agreement. It must still meet the requirements of the national employment standards. These are most common in more senior professional and managerial employees, who are generally people earning lots of money, might have a bit more flexibility. They are still bound by confidentiality. So to summarize, how does a decentralized workplace relations system work? The employees and unions will negotiate with the business, generally the employers or the HR manager, or the HR manager might act as an intermediary. They will agree and do direct negotiation, which ultimately then will be submitted to the independent government tribunal, the Fair Work Commission, who will then check this to make sure it meets it is lawful, isn't being any worse off than an industry award, meets the national employment standards, and will then ultimately approve it. In terms of advantages, this is a much more flexible system. It allows agreements to be linked to productivity. It allows you to put in individual, collective, productive incentives. People who work well or hard or productively will get paid more. You might remember that is called performance-based pay, and it is a motivational strategy. It results in stronger relations between the employer and the employee because they've actually got together and negotiated, not just trusted unions and employer associations to do it for the entire industry. And it means that any industrial dispute might be contained to a workplace. And it might even mean that we don't get to those disputes because there's been negotiations. The disadvantages are that it does create some wage inequality. More skilled, more talented people will be paid more. And this might mean, you might think that that's fair or unfair. But it also has been shown that less skilled workers often have less bargaining power. They get a little bit worse off. Now, because this is just for a business, there is less collective employee strength, particularly in the smaller businesses, and the government has less control over the determination of the agreements, and some people might say that is an advantage, but it could also be a disadvantage. And this can mean that sometimes disputes will drag on and makes the management of the economy more difficult because you might actually think there is more agreements floating around. So let's revisit, let's have a think about it. Employees are going to have their unique objectives. The employers are going to have their business objectives. The Fair Work Commission is going to have a big job to do to help assist in reducing that conflict. And ultimately, it is the human resource manager to potentially be an intermediary to assist with that. And for that, I hope this has helped you get an understanding of awards, or the centralized workplace relations, or agreements, which is a decentralized workplace relations system, and how these are used to determine wages and the conditions of work, and the relative strengths and weaknesses or advantages and disadvantages of both of these methods. Hope you found this useful and keep studying business management.